Hi everyone, I'm Nadia, and I will be talking about propaganda on social media. Specifically, this will be sort of a case study on Russia. So, what do these three images have in common? These are three images that came up when I looked up examples of propaganda. And in honesty, I was a little surprised to see some of these come up because these are not things that I would typically associate with propaganda. And that made me kind of think about what really is our definition of propaganda. So I want to start by defining propaganda. So, this is a definition from the Oxford Learners Dictionaries, and they define propaganda as ideas or statements that may be false or exaggerated and that are used in order to gain support for a political leader, party, etc. So, now looking at this definition, we can see that it's pretty broad, right? So, you can see how maybe those images that I saw earlier can fit into this definition. And this whole kind of thing of defining propaganda made me realize that how we think about propaganda can really be informed by our own political leanings or ideas, as well as the connotations. I think there's tends to be a really negative connotation associated with propaganda, and maybe that's not always appropriate. Not all forms of, what can be considered propaganda is always going to be harmful, right? So I think that's something to just keep in mind as we're thinking about this issue. So with that said, I started by defining propaganda. I will now discuss some implications of the larger issue, sort of why should we care about Russian propaganda online. I'll talk about the Kremlin's narrative and its origins. I will look at some specific tactics that Russian propaganda utilizes. I will discuss the impact of it, and then I'll finish with my limitations and concluding points. So let's look at implications, sort of why should we care about Russia's propaganda campaigns online? First and foremost, I think a lot of this stems from their ability to sway public opinion, right? If we have the power, if Russia has the power to sway the opinion of the public, maybe domestically in their own country, but also abroad, that can have a lot of impacts on policymakers. Of course, in democracies, that impact might be a little more profound, but really generally, it does have an impact on the policymakers and how all of those decisions are made. And of course, implications in this case, it might be for the stability of Europe, given the war in Ukraine, as well as when we talk about issues in Europe and the war in Ukraine now, there is always a potential for further escalation, given that Russia is a nuclear power and they have a lot of hard power when it comes to military, etc. So some implications there. So I want to highlight this, that between February and July of 2022, pro-Russian messages reached about 14.4 million users. And this is just looking at Twitter. This is from some researchers this is from some research that some German researchers did. And I want to just highlight this to remind everyone of the scope here. Again, this is just looking at on Twitter. So these messages are reaching an enormous group of people. So it does have quite a profound impact, I think. So looking at the Kremlin's actual content. So the current Kremlin narrative, the Kremlin is how Russia's government is referred to for context. So it is based in a lot of anti-American rhetoric. Really, it portrays the United States as a maligned actor seeking to dominate globally, and also portrays Russian culture and society and norms as generally superior to those of the United States. And this narrative kind of originated in the mid 2000s, but most people who have been tracking this will describe an uptick that they saw around the 2010s, kind of an intensification of this narrative that coincides with Russia's invasion of Crimea and, of course, now their invasion of Ukraine. So let's look at the Russian propaganda model itself. I want to talk about a couple of characteristics that are specific to this model. And before I do, I want to make a distinction here between trolls and bots. Now, both of these are things that Russia utilizes in their propaganda campaigns online, but there is an important distinction. So trolls are people, human beings behind the screen who are interacting with others online through commenting, posting, threads in ways that are often very inflammatory and meant to rile up emotions, make conversations even more extreme, often spread false information, things like that. And then bots are computer programs. They're not humans, but they can perform routine tasks online without human intervention. So for example, that might be a bot that is assigned to retweet Russian propaganda accounts, for example. And again, both of these are being used in Russia's propaganda campaigns. So, Russian propaganda online lacks a commitment to reality. It is not always true, and it is multi channel. Now, what does that mean exactly? So, lacking commitment to reality, meaning it is not always true, it's often quite false information that's being spread. And this allows Russian propagandists to take advantage of confirmation bias. For those who aren't familiar, confirmation bias is a social psychology phenomenon, meaning that we tend to accept as true narratives or ideas that confirm our own personal beliefs or values. So, spreading false information allows propagandists to appeal to confirmation bias and really take advantage of that, as well as take advantage of emotions. For example, we know that angry messages tend to get a lot more attention online. And when we can appeal to people's emotions through false information, it can be very impactful in terms of what they feel is true. In addition, Russian propaganda is multi-channeled. So it's not just being disseminated on social media, it's also coming out in their news outlets, their television, public radio, newspapers, all different kinds of media. And this allows them to reach a wider audience. It allows them to reach multiple generations, and it increases the overall exposure that their messages are getting. Now, Russian propaganda is also very repetitive and it is fast. Now, the repetitiveness is absolutely based in social psychology. Once again, we know that repetition builds familiarity and familiarity builds acceptance. And this is something that is called the illusory truth effect. This is another social psychology phenomenon that is defined as when we see things repetitively, essentially, we are more likely to accept them as true when we're exposed to them repetitively. So Russian propagandists can give the same messages over and over again. Those messages are more likely to be believed by their audiences. And in addition, Russian propaganda is very fast. It moves very quickly. Now, this goes back to the lacking commitment to reality. They do not have to tell the truth. And for that reason, they don't have to verify sources or any of the information that they are spreading, which allows them to often have kind of the first word on breaking news or events. And we know that first impressions can be very impactful. We know that viewers tend to believe what they first see about a breaking news story or event, and they tend to believe other messages that come out subsequently less so than they do what they see first. So having that first word can be very powerful in terms of what is seen as true. Now, I want to talk about the impacts of some of this. So these same German researchers looked at where pro-Russian messages were spreading specifically. And they found that the top countries where pro-Russian messages and accounts were being spread were the United States, Nigeria, South Africa, and India. So setting aside the United States, of course, these are countries, India, Nigeria, South Africa, these are countries that don't have the same long history of foreign policy that the United States does, or the same history with Russia even that the United States does. And many of these countries don't really have a strong stance thus far, at least in the Ukraine war. A lot of them have not really taken the same strong stances that many Western countries have. And so I think I want to highlight this because if Russia can actually appeal to the public in those countries, if Russia can make a big impact through this propaganda, it could be very consequential for their policy there and how those relationships with Russia could build. And these researchers who found this actually did sort of speculate that this could be a targeted campaign from Russia towards these countries. Now, of course, there is not really any way for us to verify that. But I think this is a really interesting point because when we think about how propaganda has been used historically versus how it's being used today, this is a big difference, is that countries can target places abroad and they have a much wider reach for their propaganda than they did when there wasn't the internet to spread it so widely, so quickly. Now, of course, I want to address some limitations. There is not a lot of research on this, especially that includes the post-Russian invasion of Ukraine mix on this. It's shaken all of this up, of course. And so this is why I didn't have a chance to include any sort of public opinion data on like how this is really impacting the Russian public's opinions on the war specifically. And this is also data that is pretty hard to get solidly because of how closed off it is for outside of Russian researchers. So that's the big limitation there. But I want to just conclude with sort of my two main takeaways here. First off, that social psychology tactics can be used very powerfully to manipulate. Russian propaganda, it's very calculated. These are tactics that are very well thought out. And so they're very powerful when used effectively to manipulate what we see as true. And then again, that Russian propaganda reaches far beyond Russia. So we're not just talking about its impact on the Russian public, but the United States public and all other countries, especially those that are potentially being targeted by Russia. So that is all. And I want to thank you all very much for your time.